Good morning, grandkids. Today we have another reading of the book that I'm writing, The Listener, based on my series, The Listener. And today we have chapter 14 and 15, both really small chapters. Nazir gave me a contract, actually 3, to keep me busy until Astrid finished finalizing, meaning getting the money for a large contract. One kill was a beggar Nafri at Iverstead. Another was for an ex-miller at Angus Mill near Windhelm. And the other was for Batilde, the boss of one of the 2 mines in Dawnstar. Nazir told me that the other mine was owned by her husband, or ex-husband. Now, that fired off an interesting theory in my brain. I was well aware of what people were really like behind their superficial masks. Maybe he had put out the contract. I decided I might just check him out while I was there. I was sure this was going to be my most interesting kill of the 3. I decided I wanted to take care of all 3 contracts once I left the Brotherhood before returning, though Nazir had said I didn't need to and could take my time. But looking at the map spread out on Astrid's table, I could see that the contracts were located all over the map, far from each other. I figured that once I was out traveling, I'd just as well keep on with it until finished. I saw on the map that I could travel north and east to Iverstead from here, then continue east and north to Windhelm, but from there I'd cut down the road to the west to Angus Mill. Then it was going to be a long way across the North Country to Dawnstar on the northern coast. I left the compound and hiked and hitched rides and finally arrived at the outskirts of Iverstead, where my last ride left me as they continued on down the road toward Riften. I had really been thankful for this last ride, which carried me through high mountain passes which were cold and full of blowing snow. Grateful also because we encountered a huge frost troll and I didn't have to fight it alone. Thankfully it was night when we got to Iverstead, and I wasn't going to have to wait around for dark. This little town was so small that when I walked in on the main street, not too far ahead was the end of it, and a bridge. A river ran past the town and past a mill, which was to my left. I saw the miller standing down by the river bank, watching a man on the other side who looked like he was talking to himself. Then he would just stop and stare into space. His house, if that's what it was literally falling apart. I figured that was my mark. My best option seemed to be walking through town, crossing the bridge, and then back up the opposite side of the river. I started walking, trying to look like any other traveler, tipping my head at a passing guard and saying, "Good evening, sir." When I made it across the bridge, I got off the path and started making my way along the hillside and weaving my way through rocks and trees until I came out at the back of the shack. Nefri stood there past his house out in the open in full moonlight, doing that staring into space thing. I wished there was a way to lure him inside the shack. Although there were so many boards gone off the place, even the doors, that anyone across the river could practically see straight through it. I went inside and walked to the empty front door to see who over there might seem interested in what was going on over here. The miller, who had walked away earlier, was back, but up in a shadowed nook by his mill wheel. He evidently was watching. The moon was shining directly on me in the doorway. He saw me. He lifted his hand slightly, turned away, and strolled up to the road. Either he was going for a guard, or he recognized me for what I was. I moved out of the doorway and waited a minute or two. No guards in sight. I pulled out one dagger and stepped out the back, slipping up directly behind Nefri. I checked across the river. Nothing. Then I did two things at once. I clamped one hand over his mouth, pulling his head, and swung my blade around to the front of his neck and sliced. No sound. A clean and silent kill. Since I had hold of him, and still no one across the way was in sight, I pulled him backward, dragging him behind his house. I then went back up the hillside, through the trees and boulders, and recrossed the bridge. I kind of worried a little about meeting the guards again, but they showed no signs of having seen me before. Really bad guards, if you ask me. The one interesting but not expected thing was the miller. He was now standing up here in front of his mill with his arms crossed, watching me with an ever so slight smile. I gave him a little salute as I passed and hurried on out of town. I now could hire a carriage. Sorry, kids. I knew I could hire a carriage from Riften to Windhelm, so I started out hiking to Riften. A very boring trip. Once there, I rented a room at the local pub and sat down at the bar for some food and wine. Now here I am sitting at a table in my room, bringing this journal up to date with my ramblings for you, whomever you might be. Chapter 15. I walked out of Riften the next morning and the carriage was gone, out with another customer, the stable hand said. So I started walking again. At the rate I was going, At this rate, I was going to need a new pair of boots. I shortly came to a place at a house or two in a mine. It was called Shores something or other. I wasn't paying any attention to the people or the place, only a wagon pulling out from in front of the mine loaded with ore. I asked where he was headed, and he said Windhelm. I asked if he'd mind having company with him, and that I'd pay handsomely, to which he smiled and said, "Hop up here," and off we went. It was a ride of contentment for me. The air was sweet, the birds were mellow, and the driver was silent. My mind was busy planning my next moves. At Windhelm, the driver dropped me at the stables, tipped his head at me in a farewell and salute, and drove up over the bridge toward the city gates. I asked the stable owner if I could rest in one of the stalls until evening and that I'd pay him for the privilege. He said, "Sure thing, for a little coin, of course," which I gladly handed over. We all have to make that coin in our own way. Thankfully, he had mucked out the stall earlier. Thankfully, he had mucked out the stall earlier that day and spread down clean, so the smell was bearable. He offered to share mead with me until his next ride came along. I eventually settled back to wait for night to approach. In the early evening, I was listening to some wolves somewhere in the distance. Their calls to one another sounded not too far up the road from where I'd be walking. I imagined that they could smell me and were having a good time planning their attack for taking me out. At any rate, I knew I'd be having them to contend with later on. I finally decided to get on with it, got up and brushed straw off my backside and set out up the road. I hadn't gone 50 yards until I spotted them lurking in some bushes on the river side of the road. I saw 3 black ones, which was odd in this white, snowy region. Maybe this area wasn't quite high enough up in the mountains. They knew I had arrived and burst out of the bushes. I already had my bow out, anticipating their charge. I was ready for the leader coming at me as the other 2 flanked me right and left. I fired at the leader, and he took an arrow in the shoulder, causing him to pause for a bit. In one motion, I had my bow away and 2 daggers in my hands. I whipped my arms straight out to each side and slashed at both wolves coming in. That insane maneuver looked cool as heck, but didn't work out as I had envisioned. I missed one, and he circled around. I cut the other one and saw drops of blood drifting, making red holes in the white snow. He backed off a little. Still 0 for 3. Dang it. As the leader in front decided to charge again, I did slice him deeply across the throat, and he dropped, done for. The one I hadn't touched yet was still circling, as if just waiting to get me, all to himself. That was all right with me. 1-on-1 would be much more in my favor than his. Meanwhile, the injured one got up his courage to try me again, but he was weak and was an easy kill. He went down without a whimper. Now the time had come. The untouchable one stopped, facing me, his head low, his stance ready. His yellow eyes looked in mine. As we stared at one another, I raised my 2 daggers, straight forward as he lunged. His lunge was too high, and literally he impaled himself. He died instantly and fell on top of me, and we both went to the ground. He seemed to weigh a ton, but I managed to extract my knives and myself. I looked at the 3 of them. Not clean kills by any means, but hey, I'm an assassin, not a wolf hunter. I went down to the river's edge, cleaned off the daggers, and once again headed up the road. It was now fully night, no moon, and shadows deep and dark. The snow had started falling, thick with large flakes. Good, that would help in concealing me. I was feeling like this kill was going to be as easy as Narvi was. Certainly easier than the wolves, and certainly with a little finesse. More finesse, which could always be famous last words if I got too cocky. I came to a stone bridge which crossed over near the bottom of a waterfall, and of course there stood the mill. I crossed, and the road turned up past the mill with a house on the other side of the road. How did I want to do this? Nazir said a couple ran the mill, and that Amodius' camp was camped out near the river. There was no trees or good hiding spots on the river side of the road, and if the snow let up and the moon popped out, I would be definitely exposed over there. I climbed up and walked on the side of a low hill, keeping in among the rocks and pines until I came to the back of the house. Across the road I could see the mill and someone moving around. I didn't have long to wait before two people crossed the road towards me and went into the house. Hopefully, they would stay there. I waited and listened for maybe 5 minutes with nothing moving. Finally, I climbed down out of my hiding spot and sprinted across the road, ducking behind the far side of the mill. I came back around to the front and started to search farther up the snowy bank of the river, toward an upper, smaller waterfall. Of course, that's when the snow stopped. The moon popped out and gleefully shone a spotlight on me. Great. I dropped flat on the ground and hardly breathed. Nothing moved or made a sound. I raised up but stayed crouched as I topped a low rise, and there was the campsite, completely out of sight of mill or house. A small fire was still flickering, with a few more pieces of wood stacked nearby. The prize was inside the tent, sleeping. I could hear the snores. The tent was open at both ends, his feet at one end, his head at the other. Excellent. I slowly drew out one dagger and crept around the tent to his head. I slowly leaned down and looked at him, wondering now who would want this little man out of the way. What had he done? I always wondered about whenever I had accepted a contract. Why? But if I asked, the answer was always some version of the same theme. You don't need to know. At any rate, I did two things, quickly and together. I clamped one hand over his mouth, pulling his head up and back, slashing his throat with the dagger. Not a sound. Since everything was peaceful and quiet, I pulled one of the pieces of firewood over to the campfire, pulled out my journal, and put the saw down before I forgot anything. I especially wanted to tell you about the wolf fight. That would have been a cool-looking maneuver if it had worked, right? So that's the end of those two chapters. And I will see you in the next reading of The Listener. Bye-bye, grandkids.